Hare Krishna. So let's get started. We left off last Thursday, reading the foreword of the book, Srila Prabhupada and Gurukula. The foreword written by His Holiness Satsvarupa Maharaj. Now we're going to go to the introduction written by formerly His Holiness Jagadish Das Goswami, who was at the time when this was written, 1982, he was ISKCON's Minister of Education. So let's get to it. Introduction by Jagadish Das Goswami. As the Krishna consciousness movement took root in America, Srila Prabhupada contemplated the eventual need to educate his disciples' children. As early as 1968, barely 2 years after founding the movement, he wrote letters to his disciples hinting at his plans to organize schools. As early as 1968. Because Srila Prabhupada saw the modern schools as indoctrinating the helpless children in sense gratification and mental speculation, he called the schools slaughterhouses. He wanted to offer an alternative, not only to the children of his own disciples, but to anyone who could appreciate the need. To save people from suffering repeated birth and death by training them from childhood in devotional service to the Supreme Lord, Srila Prabhupada began his Gurukula schools. If you want to share something via chat, if you have a question, just put it in the chat and I will at least share my realizations on it as best as I can. So it's interesting how Srila Prabhupada called public education slaughterhouses, particularly because they indoctrinated children towards sense gratification, right? To become consumers. And we know in 1968, that was something that was really, Srila Prabhupada was ahead of his time. But it's not uncommon for us to find studies where the education system is really shown to be very good at training consumers, right? There's a number of studies to that effect, how the education system, where it can be, of course, necessary and good in terms of academic studies and secular development, but oftentimes the skills in order to be truly productive members of society, rather than just consumers, is often lacking. So Prabhupada was really ahead of his time in terms of recognizing that and stating explicitly that the modern school system was about creating consumers, non-thinking, non-discretionary consumers. In establishing his Gurukulas, Srila Prabhupada followed the prescription of Srimad Bhagavatam, a contrast with the status quo in India, where Gurukulas trained students to become Sanskrit scholars. Srila Prabhupada did not want Sanskrit schools. He would sometimes say, "Many Pandit Sanskrit scholars are loitering in the streets with nothing to do. What is their value?" So it is obvious that Srila Prabhupada wanted the students of his Gurukulas to be productive members of society with a practical ability to help and to contribute to society in a practical, hands-on way, not just to be erudite Sanskrit scholars, but without any practical relevance of their knowledge in broader society. He wanted his students, his disciples, his Gurukul students, to have relevance in modern society. He based his Gurukula program on the principles described by Narad Muni in the 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Brahmachari Gurukule Vasandhanto Gurodhiratham Acharandhasavan Nicho Gurau Sudhridha Sauhrida. A student should practice completely controlling his senses. He should be submissive and should have an attitude of firm friendship for the spiritual master. With a great vow, the brahmachari should live at the Gurukula only for the benefit of the Guru. This verse that Jagadish Maharaj is quoting, formerly Jagadish Prabhu, formerly Jagadish Maharaj was quoting from the 7th chapter, is very important that when hearing these references, we take the entire context of the 7th chapter. In the 7th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, for 3 or 4 chapters, Narad Muni describes the Varnashram system. And when we hear about the ashram, right, the 4 ashrams, the brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha, and sannyasa, it's very important that we take the entirety of that description by Narad Muni into account rather than one particular verse and basing principles on one single particular principle without understanding the entire context. For example, this particular verse, Narad Muni describes that the disciple lives with the Guru. Now, this is where, unfortunately, in ISKCON, in the early days of ISKCON particularly, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the early 90s, when ISKCON was trying to establish Gurukulas, as Srila Prabhupada instructed, the only model that comes close to what Gurukula actually is, are boarding schools, right? If we take the idea, the principle of a Gurukula, where the student lives with the spiritual master, the only thing that comes to mind is a boarding school. Unfortunately, that's a problem. And we see how it became a problem in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when we in ISKCON tried to establish Gurukulas. Because, let's take what Srila Prabhupada himself said, right? If the public schools or slaughterhouses, right? Students get up, they go to public school, they come back home. Srila Prabhupada described those as slaughterhouses because they simply inculcated the idea that children and students should just engage in sense gratification. So if that is a slaughterhouse, what to speak of a boarding school? At least in a day school, the children can, if they're devotee children, they may leave the home, devotee parents, go to a so-called slaughterhouse, unfortunately have to deal with that, but then they come back home to their Vaishnav parents and their home is a mandir. So at least there is a counterbalance to what's being taught, or what they're being inculcated in a so-called slaughterhouse school. And there's some respite by coming back to a Vaishnav home, mandir. But if the model is a boarding school, which is the only idea that the devotees had in the 60s and 70s of what a Gurukula should look like, all they understood was a boarding school, then we can easily understand how the implementation of Gurukula was a total disaster. Gurukula is not a boarding school. It is very, very important we come to understand and recognize that. Gurukula is actually the closest model of what a Gurukula is homeschooling, not a boarding school. The child moves to the home of the spiritual master. And this is why, let me just mark my spell. We only got 2 paragraphs into the introduction. But this is very important to understand the model of what Gurukula actually is and how we got it so terribly wrong in the late 60s or 70s, actually, right? Gurukula was started by Srila Prabhupada. The first Gurukula was started in 1972. This year, or last year, 1971, because last year was the 50th anniversary of Srila Prabhupada's Gurukulas. So in the 70s and 80s, how we got it so wrong is thinking it was a boarding school. Gurukula is not a boarding school. Quite the contrary. The closest model to what a traditional Gurukula is homeschooling. Now let's explore this so that we get a clear understanding of how Gurukula works. The first thing is that Gurukulas are not run by sannyasis and vanaprasthas. Maybe vanaprasthas, but certainly not sannyasis. Unfortunately, in ISKCON, in the early years of Gurukula, 70s and 80s, the sannyasis were very much involved in Gurukula education. And it is understandable in a sense that the sannyasis at that time, ISKCON was in its inception. ISKCON was very new. Everything in ISKCON was new. These sannyasis were the ones who had gotten the most exposure to Srila Prabhupada's teachings, right? They had the greatest access to Srila Prabhupada. They had the most hands-on training directly from Srila Prabhupada. So naturally, the sannyasis are in a unique position to give their at least their understanding of Srila Prabhupada's teachings to the rest of the organization, the rest of ISKCON. So Srila Prabhupada's sannyasis were very much at the center, at the core of establishing Gurukula and establishing everything in ISKCON in those days, particularly after Srila Prabhupada left in 77. Unfortunately, according to the Varnashram system, sannyasis do not run Gurukulas. Grihastas run Gurukulas, not sannyasis. And this is very important. So we have to understand Varnashram. And what time is it? If you have any questions, remember, use the chat, and I will read the chat, and we can have some discussions through the chat in that way. The first 5 years, right, from 0 to 5, the child is inundated, is spoiled senseless, is spoiled fully and completely, just overwhelmed with love of mom and dad and the family. That's all the child needs. That is essential for what the child needs from 0 to 5 years old, right? To get completely inundated with a strong, loving family, loving relationships as much as possible from 0 to 5. From 5 to 26, the child goes to Gurukula, traditionally. They go to Gurukula and they're trained strictly as a brahmachari, right? Strong regulation, controlling the senses, right? We know from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6, Yukta Hara Viharasya, one who is regulated in his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practicing yoga. So from 5 to 26, right, 20 years, the child, young boy, young man, is trained in Gurukula. Now, he is entered the Gurukula of a Grihasta, not a sannyasi. This is very important, and I shall describe as we will see as we go on. Not a sannyasi. When the student graduates Gurukula at 26, he goes on to get married. When he gets married, his natural emotional inclination is to base his own marriage on what he experienced, right? Not in Gurukula, but what he experienced at home with his mom, his dad. He emotionally connects with that past, his 0 to 5, 6, whatever, before he came to Gurukula. That home life, he's going to replicate now in his own Grihasta life, with his wife, his children, and so on. So that's the connection. He's left behind the Gurukula years. He's learned, he's lived as a brahmachari, but now he's married. He wants to replicate, he will naturally, emotionally go to replicate what he experienced as a child in his own life with his mom and dad and his siblings. And this is where the Grihastha then becomes capable of being a Gurukul teacher, right? He's come out of Gurukula, but he's replicating his home life. But he also has a training of a Gurukul teacher. He also has a training of a brahmachari. So at this point, this person can balance the training of a brahmachari with the love he experienced in home life. And that is where new students come into that person's Gurukula, to live with that person, because that person can balance Gurukul life, the strictures, the regulation of Gurukul life, while he's also trying to establish the love, the support, the emotional empowerment that he experienced in his own childhood. So it's the perfect place to have new students to come into that person's Gurukula. That's why the Grihastas are Gurukul teachers. They can balance both. Now let's keep exploring this. So now this is if after coming out of brahmachari training, enters the Grihastha ashram, doesn't mean he wants to be a Gurukul teacher. Perhaps not. He'll go on to, if he's a Kshatriya, Vaishya, whatever he may be, he'll go on to engage in some activity, but he's still going to create as an ashram. Varna is different. As an ashram, he's going to replicate what he experienced in his childhood in his own ashram, in his own Grihastha life. So it's a strong, loving Grihastha life with his own children growing up there, or his own children in Gurukula, whatever it may be. But as he gets older and he reaches 50 years of age, what happens? We all know what happens. I'll be turning 50 this year myself as well. So we all know what's coming. What happens? What's the term for it? It's on the tip of my tongue. Midlife crisis, right? We know psychologically from the ages 45 to 55, 60 is where the individual hits a midlife crisis. The midlife crisis is where the individual reverts back to the activities of their youth. Now, it's a problem and that's why when we see persons who in the modern era, men who hit the midlife crisis, what do? They get a fast car, they chase young women, and they act like morons. Right? In other words, they do exactly what they did in their youth when they were in high school, young men, chased young girls, drove around in foolish cars, and acted like morons. That's what happens when they hit the midlife crisis, they revert back to their youth. Varnashram, this is the beauty of Varnashram. We just gave a lecture 2 days ago about how Krishna, right, the verse of the week, Chaturvanyam Mayashasham Gunakarma Vibhagasha. Krishna says, I designed Varnashram. And the beauty of this design is that in Varnashram, the individual hits 50 years old, hits a midlife crisis. Psychologically, they're going to revert back to their youth. Now, if they were in Gurukula, if they were being trained as a brahmachari in their youth, what are they going to revert back to? They're going to revert back to brahmachari life. So they're not going to be chasing young women. They're not going to be acting stupid. They're not going to be trying to buy cherry red convertible cars. They're going to revert back to brahmachari life. They're going to revert back to that time of regulation, a time of swadhyaya, Vedic study, that time of serving the spiritual master. That's the Varnashram. That's the Varnashram, the Vanaprastha ashram. So this is how we see the Varnashram system is very, very important. Auto T will begin at 7:30. I'm having a little class now.
Sure, no worries. Yeah, just fine.
Sure, absolutely. So this is the beauty of the varnashram system, right? It makes perfect sense when we understand it in that progression. So the person has reached the midlife crisis. They've reverted back to their brahmachari training. So they're not chasing young girls, they're not acting like idiots. They're reverting back to that time of their youth, and happily so. But they're now in their vanaprastha ashram. They may, if they're with their wives are also suited to that because they went through the same training at home, maybe not in the Gurukula, but the girls did this at home. So they're also reverting back to that same type of training. If there was no wife involved, then the person becomes a sannyasi. But as a sannyasi, he's living as a brahmachari with that same stringent, austere brahmachari training. That's not conducive for him to be training children, right? Because the grihastha ashram, that ashram that is conducive to strong emotional supports for children, that's not necessarily required in that stage of life as a sannyasi. So sannyasis are not suited for running gurukulas. That's not where they are emotionally settled. The Gurukula requires, because Gurukula is dealing with children, so the Gurukula requires the Grihastha ashram, which is very, very empowering emotionally, stable emotionally, is supportive emotionally. That's what the Grihastha ashram does. So it's the Grihasthas that run Gurukulas, not sannyasis. And that's where ISKCON, we got it wrong. In the early days, in the 60s or 70s, and even into the 80s, our Gurukulas were run, led by, administered by sannyasis. That on top of many other shortcomings in terms of just establishing Gurukula to begin with, it was, one can almost say, in hindsight, we recognize we were almost doomed to failure, the Gurukula system, right? Now we are 50 years on, and students who have gone to Gurukula are now in a position where they can, according to the actual varnashram system, they can begin to facilitate the proper development of Gurukula. Okay, so let's continue reading. Narad Muni has advised that to receive, hold on just a moment. Narad Muni has advised that to receive the proper Krishna conscious training, the brahmachari should reside in the ashram of his guru. One other thing I want to mention. Last week was the verse of the week. Last week was chapter 4, text 13, right? Chaturvanyamaya shrishtam guna karma vibhagasha tasya kataramapiman vidya kataramavyayam. This week, sorry, that's the verse for this week. Next week's verse, chapter 4, text 34, tadvidi pranipatena. It's a very good verse. And as we see in this introduction here, Jagadish Prabhu quotes Srila Prabhupada, who quotes Narad Muni, and Prabhupada quotes Brahmachari Guru Gureva Sandanto Gurodhitam. And Prabhupada talks about the relationship between, quoting Narad Muni, talks about the relationship between the guru and the disciple. All right, just a moment here. And I want to go into this because the relationship between the guru and disciple is very, very important, but I won't do it here because that is a foundational relationship in spiritual life, right? And I want to take the opportunity next week on Tuesday when we go over next week's verse in the Tuesday lecture chapter 4, text 34. I want to take that opportunity to really dive into the relationship between the guru and the disciple, because that's the perfect verse in which to dive into this relationship. So we won't do it here, even though it's important in the Gurukula system to understand the guru-disciple relationship. We won't go over it here. We'll go over it in Tuesday's lecture on chapter 4, text 34. So let's continue to read. I was actually hoping to finish the introduction today. I don't think we'll be able to, but we'll carry on. Narada Muni has advised that to receive the proper Krishna conscious training, the brahmachari should reside in the ashram of his guru. The parents may be competent and Krishna conscious, but due to other engagements, they cannot properly attend to their child's spiritual training. Also, parents often find it difficult to give their offspring the proper discipline. This is very interesting because here in Massachusetts, when the students come for Bhagavad Gita class, I had one student, she was very, very young. She was 4 years old. And the parents were insistent they wanted their child to come and join the Bhagavad Gita class on the weekend. I said, okay. So they came, and the first week, they came and they left the 4-year-old. And of course, she was a little skittish. She was unsure what's going on. And I asked the parents, okay, just leave and leave her here with me and the other students, and I'll see what I can do. So we had a Bhagavad Gita class, a Bhagavad Gita shloka, with shloka memorization. And she was doing okay. It was new to her. She was unsure. She's been in the temple before, so she's been in the space. So the space wasn't foreign. She has seen me a number of times, so I wasn't foreign. So she felt comfortable, but she'd never been in a Gurukula shloka class. And she was doing well, and she was responding. And the class ended. Parents came back, and it was perfectly fine. The next week, she came with her parents, and the parents wanted to sit in. They wanted to experience to see how she was doing. They wanted to see it firsthand. And it was an absolute disaster. The poor little girl, she could not, because her parents were there, she simply could not focus on the class at hand. And I couldn't discipline her. I was trying to, but it was just, the dynamic was ruined in terms of, we'll be having oddity in 2 minutes. The dynamic was ruined. And I asked the parents, please, you have to leave. If you leave, this can work. While you're here, it simply will not work. And sure enough, the parents got up, left the room, and left the girl there. But the girl, she knew her parents were just in the other room. The week before, that wasn't the case. They actually left the building. She knew they were in the other room, so she kept wanting to get up and see and look, and then she would whine a little bit to see if the parents were paying attention. So the dynamic was a bit different. So this is what Jagadish Prabhu is alluding to here. Also, parents often find it difficult to give their offspring the proper discipline. A parent cannot control the behavior of his child in the same way that the child's guru can. The guru's ashram provides the right atmosphere for the spiritual progress of the child. By observing certain regulations, following particular schedule, and performing activities conducive to his spiritual advancement, the student becomes disciplined. Narada Muni also prescribes that the student should learn to control his senses, because if one cannot control his senses, they will drag him away from spiritual life. Either one controls his senses or one's senses controls him. One who cannot control his senses can act according to his intelligence, but one who is controlled by his senses is forced to act by the 3 modes of material nature. So I'll read one more paragraph, and then I have to go and perform oddity. In Gurukula, sense control is taught by practice of austerities. The children do not practice difficult, unnecessary austerities, but certain austerities like rising early and attending Mangalarati. Culture a spirit of devotion to Lord Krishna, and are essential part of Gurukul training. Maharaj Risabhadev advises Tapo Divyam. Human beings must accept the austerities or difficulties which help them advance in spiritual life. The students are taught to use their senses in Krishna's service. They learn that their senses are meant not for personal enjoyment, but for Krishna's enjoyment. Their enjoyment will come from pleasing Krishna. By learning to engage their senses in the service of the Lord, the students experience the highest standard of happiness. And it really comes, we'll end there. What it really comes down to is that verse in Bhagavad Gita, Yukta Hara Viharasya, Yukta Chestasya Karmasya, Yukta Swapnava Bhodasya, Yoga Bhavati Dukkha. From the 6th chapter, when Krishna describes Ashtanga Yoga, right? Krishna says, one who is regulated. And that's what the brahmachari training, the Gurukul training is all about. It's about regulation. Krishna says, speaking to Arjuna, one who is regulated in his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practicing the yoga system. That's what Gurukul does. It's about regulating all of these things in the practice of yoga so that the mitigation of material distress can take place. When there's a mitigation of material distress, then the Gurukul students can focus on higher cognitive spiritual activities. So we'll end there. We didn't quite finish the introduction, but I have to do arati. And we'll continue next Thursday at 7 p.m. Hare Krishna.